Is African news, and a UN Special Court delivers a landmark judgment and rejects the crimes against humanity appeal of Liberia's ex-president. Charles Taylor faces a half-century jail term over the charges. Also, Al-Shabaab insurgents behind the Westgate Mall massacre strike again in Kenya. At least 3 are killed in attacks on Kenyan border towns. And fresh protests have broken out in Sudan as the death toll mounts following 4 days of rioting over the scrapping of fuel subsidies. First up, victims of Sierra Leone's civil war hailed a victory for justice after a Hague court upheld the 50-year jail term of former Liberian President Charles Taylor. Now, the UN-backed Special Court for Sierra Leone rejected the appeal against last year's war crimes conviction. Taylor was accused of having financed the bloody rampages of rebels in neighbouring Sierra Leone before the conflict's end in 1992. On Thursday, judges said Taylor was aware the militia's sole purpose was to spread terror through murder and mutilation. While Cynthia Taylor is in The Hague for France 24, I asked her about the reaction to the verdict from the victims' families.
That's what prosecutor Brenda Hollis expects. In fact, she mentioned that she was hoping that this would serve as some sort of closure and that people would feel justice has been served. This is for the families of the victims. This is for the survivors of these crimes, and it's also for the people of Sierra Leone. But Brenda Hollis pointed out something that she said, well, although there was a victory for these people, in no ways is this a celebration. Basically, what the prosecutor said was that the crimes were such awful crimes that it's a time for reflection rather than a celebration.
Now, Cynthia, the tribunal is still to decide on where Taylor will serve out his sentence. The UK, Finland and Sweden have enforcement agreements with the court, but Taylor's lawyer says that he prefers the only African nation on the list. We'll take a moment just to have a listen.
So I think for Charles Taylor, a more appropriate place would be Rwanda, and I'm very minded to make an application to the presidency in short order that Mr. Taylor be sent to Rwanda. All special court detainees so far are serving their sentences in Rwanda, and I think this is the logical place that he ought to serve his sentence at.
Now, Cynthia, how clever a move is it for Taylor to hope to serve out his term in Rwanda, considering the country's feelings about the treatment of African defendants by the Hague courts?
Well, to start with, the likelihood that Charles Taylor will go to Rwanda, it's rather small, according to most analysts. It's almost a done deal that he's going to the UK. In fact, a researcher today told me he was almost 100% sure that's going to happen. Well, the thing has to do, of course, people claim that courts such as International Criminal Court, also in The Hague, are more of an African court, that they are prosecuting African countries, and it's more a political game. So in that matter, in fact, what the defense lawyers kept on saying was that this was a political trial, but the move to go to an African country could also be regarded somehow as a political game. So the tables are turning, I suppose.
Cynthia Taylor there for us in The Hague. In other news, Somali Al-Shabaab militants have warned Kenya to brace itself for more bloodshed following fatal attacks on towns on the border between the two countries. At least 2 policemen were killed when members of the Islamist extremist group attacked Mandera on Thursday, and another person lost his life in the town of Wajir late on Wednesday. The border has since been closed, coming in the wake of the bloody siege of a Nairobi mall by Al-Shabaab this week. Somalians living in the Kenyan capital say they have since started fearing persecution and revenge attacks. Our correspondent sent us this report.
It's the call to prayer in the Nairobi neighbourhood nicknamed Little Mogadishu. 90% of the people here are of Somali origin. Everyone we meet says they're shocked by the Westgate Mall attack. They completely reject any links between the Somali community here and the Al-Shabaab militants.
Whether Somalis or non-Somalis, Muslims or non-Muslims, these are very bad people. Nobody respects them. Among our community here,
I don't believe these people, they are specialists Somali. They are not Somali people, I think. I think they are different nationalities.
Of course there are fears when such things happen. The Somali becomes afraid when such attacks happen.
There are more than 200,000 ethnic Somalians living in this neighborhood. We're right across town from the Westgate shopping mall. But every time there's a terror attack in Kenya, people here fear a crackdown. In the past 2 years, Little Mogadishu has seen ethnic violence, grenade attacks and police raids. Sayed Hassan Anteno tells us Kenyan police have arrested and held him several times without reason.
They beat you, they threaten you. We are Somali, you are Al-Shabaab. Simple, you are Al-Shabaab, you are Somali. So what? If I'm Somali, is it a crime to be Somali? The Somalis are soft target. They may simply accuse the Somalis, then you will be arrested. You have no right here.
In the wake of the deadly Westgate attack, Somalians in the Kenyan capital fear they could face reprisals or another round of arrests.
In Nigeria, a pastor and his 2 children were killed by suspected Boko Haram terrorists on Thursday. The Islamist extremists first opened fire before torching the victims' church in the town of Droa in Yobe State. Now, the violence follows the emergence of a video in which a man who resembles the sect's leader, Abu Bakr Shekau, mocked reports of his death. The military's been waging a war on Boko Haram and had claimed that he'd likely been fatally wounded in clashes at the end of June. Despite rising tensions in Guinea-Conakry ahead of parliamentary voting on Saturday, the Election Commission today claimed preparations for the polls were well on their way, with 70% of the voter cards having been handed out. The country's first legislative vote in over a decade is 2 years overdue and sparked days of clashes earlier this week. President Alpha Conde's camps denied the opposition's accusations that he's planning on rigging the vote. Dozens died in violent protests in May, and some fear that the recent unrest will just keep escalating.
We're scared. We're so scared. We don't sleep. There's no security.
We are talking about the elections, but we should think about peace first. Before, there wasn't all this in Guinea. There weren't all these clashes.
Sudanese authorities have put the first official death toll out after protests first broke out on Monday. They've set those at 29. Fresh rioting erupted on Thursday. Demonstrators are furious about the government's decision to scrap fuel subsidies, a move that's hit the poorest the hardest.
In Sudan, the anger over fuel subsidies has not abated. For the 4th day in a row, there were protests. Many demonstrators have been killed this week. Like during the Arab Spring in other countries, protesters chanted freedom and we want the fall of the regime. We spoke to a France 24 observer in Khartoum.
The youth are well organized. They have learned from experiences in other countries. They use Facebook, the internet. They have formed committees in some districts to try and prevent the police from going there and arresting people like they did during past demonstrations.
The internet was restored on Thursday after a one-day cut for unexplained reasons. The government decision to scrap fuel subsidies led to a rise in prices and triggered the unrest. Since South Sudan became independent 2 years ago, Khartoum has lost billions of dollars in oil revenue. Activists called on social media for fresh protests on Friday, the weekly Muslim day of prayers.
To Senegal now, where there have also been protests, these in Dakar, where residents have been expressing their frustration over water cuts. So far, they have been pretty limited, but after 2 weeks of shortages, they're concerned that protests could gather momentum if the water's off for much longer.
On Wednesday evening, several dozen demonstrators burnt tyres in Dakar, but many fear that the protests could swell. For 2 weeks, there has been a water shortage in the capital, and on top of that, there are frequent power cuts. The police dispersed the angry protesters.
We are always ignored. We are part of the population. We've had enough.
We're fed up with Macky Sall. All the things we blamed Wad for are still here.
Water trucks are sent to the neighbourhoods that need it most. The new Prime Minister, Aminata Touré, recently visited the water distribution centre to inspect repairs on the ruptured pipeline that has caused the shortage.
The government will identify the responsible parties, whomever they may be, and take the necessary decisions, whether in the form of a sanction or a breach of contract, because this kind of situation is not normal.
The water crisis has forced President Macky Sall to cut short his visit to the UN General Assembly in New York and return to Senegal.
Thanks very much for joining us for Africa News. I'm going to hand over to you, Mark. Thanks,
Georgia. Thank you very much indeed. Georgia Callum-Smith returns tomorrow, of course, with more Africa News. We are taking a short break. After that, we return with another World News update, as well as sport and our special focus. In sport, a look back at that very dramatic denouement at the America's Cup. Stay with us.